She thought my farm was her personal shortcut. Tires crushing the earth, mud flying everywhere, and a grin that said, "I own this place." Every time she drove across my land, I felt the weight of her arrogance pressing down. But I had been watching, calculating, waiting. Every predictable turn she made, every careless acceleration, every glance that dared to ignore my fences, it all mattered. The trench was ready, dug in secret, filled with soft, sticky mud, perfectly positioned along the path she always took. Safe, harmless, but unforgettable. I sipped my coffee from the porch as the familiar rumble of her SUV approached. The moment she rolled over that mud-filled trap, her shortcut would become her undoing. Tires spun. Mud splashed. Panic set in. And all the neighbors who had watched silently for months finally saw justice unfold. Hit subscribe. Watch till the end. Farm had always been my sanctuary, a stretch of rolling fields, fenced pastures, and muddy paths that I knew like the lines on my own hands. It wasn't much to outsiders, just a patch of land at the edge of town, but to me, it was a lifetime of work, pride, and quiet routine. Each morning, I walked the perimeter, checking fences, inspecting the soil, and listening to the subtle rhythms of life that thrived in the quiet corners. Then came Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA, whose idea of community rules extended far beyond her property. At first, it was subtle, a wheel rolling over a patch of crops, a tire track across the freshly tilled soil. I chalked it up to carelessness, a minor inconvenience. But carelessness became arrogance, and arrogance became a pattern. She began driving across my farm like it was her personal shortcut. Morning, afternoon, any time she felt impatient or entitled, her SUV would tear across the dirt paths I had cultivated for years. Every pass left behind a trail of mud, flattened plants, and a growing sense of violation. I left polite notes. I spoke to her directly. I reminded her that it was private land. Nothing worked. She treated my farm as if it existed solely for her convenience. I started observing. Watching her timing, her route, the way she always accelerated at the same spot near the east fence. It was predictable, almost mechanical. The arrogance that had seemed untouchable suddenly revealed itself as a flaw, an opportunity. That's when I decided to act, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with strategy. I dug a trench along the path she used most, just wide enough to hold her vehicle briefly in mud, deep enough to make a statement, shallow enough to cause no real harm. It would be a lesson in respect, a visual and undeniable reminder that her entitlement had limits. 4 days, I monitored the soil, ensuring it was the perfect consistency. Too wet, and her tires might slip uncontrollably. Too dry, and the trap would fail. I studied the rain patterns, the sun's angle, and the firmness of the dirt. Every detail mattered because timing was everything. Neighbors had noticed her behavior. Whispers floated over fences, quiet laughter at the repeated audacity, but no one dared intervene. They had become spectators, watching her disregard for rules, her sense of invincibility. I understood why. They didn't know what I had planned. Finally, everything was ready. The trench dug, the mud carefully positioned, cameras discreetly hidden, and my vantage point clear. All that remained was waiting. And I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The moment she hit that patch of mud, the shortcut she had taken for granted for months would transform into a spectacle she would never forget. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and grass, and the farm felt quieter than usual, as if it knew something was about to happen. I stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the horizon. Every detail mattered. The way the sunlight hit the trench, the texture of the mud, even the slight bend in the fence where her tires always clipped the posts. Today, patience would pay off. Her engine's hum reached me long before the vehicle appeared, a familiar sound that had once filled me with frustration but now carried the promise of resolution. I could see her SUV crest the hill in the distance, gleaming as if the world belonged to her alone. Tires rolling over gravel, the predictable acceleration, the confident tilt of her head. It was almost poetic how predictable arrogance could be. I adjusted my position slightly, ensuring the hidden cameras had a clear view. Every angle, every possible reaction had been considered. The trench was shallow, safe, but perfectly positioned. The mud, thick and sticky from recent rains, waited silently for the moment of truth. She drove faster now, oblivious to the subtle warning signs I had left. Slight shifts in the soil near the path, footprints leading away from the trench, and the small, almost invisible stakes marking its edges. Karen never looked down. She never noticed details that contradicted her assumptions. That had always been her weakness. The moment her tires hit the edge of the trench, I felt a twinge of anticipation. Nothing had changed. The scene was exactly as planned. The SUV began to sink slowly, first the front wheels, then the back, as mud clung to the tires and resisted their spin. She tried to accelerate, spinning the wheels faster, but the more she pushed, the deeper the vehicle sank. A quiet thrill ran through me, not from malice, but from justice being served without harm. The neighbors, peeking from windows and porches, began to notice, their murmurs floating across the farm. Their astonishment mirrored my own quiet satisfaction. Her frustration grew palpable. Shouts and curses, muffled by the distance, filled the air. Every attempt to free the vehicle only embedded it deeper, the mud refusing to release its grip. The visual effect was undeniable. Her shortcut, once a symbol of entitlement, now a trap she could not escape. I remained calm, observing, documenting, and letting the natural consequences unfold. The air seemed thicker now, charged with tension and the electric thrill of anticipation. The predictable arrogance had met its match, and the lesson was playing out exactly as intended. For the first time, she was forced to confront her assumptions, her disregard for boundaries, and the consequences of treating private property as her personal playground. The stage was set for the final act, the climax of this months-long struggle, where entitlement met accountability in the mud-filled trench that she would never forget. The sun had climbed higher now, casting long shadows across the farm. Every blade of grass glistened with dew, every ridge of soil outlined the path that Karen had once used without consequence. From my vantage point on the porch, coffee long forgotten, I watched her SUV approach the trench. The engine's hum was steady, confident, and utterly oblivious to the trap lying in wait. She never slowed. Every instinct, every assumption, had told her that my land was hers to cross. Tires rumbled over gravel, picked up speed, and then hit the soft edge of the trench. The vehicle shuddered slightly at first, the front wheels sinking into the thick mud. She pressed the accelerator, but the tires spun uselessly, throwing mud in all directions. The SUV began to sink deeper, a slow and humiliating descent that mirrored months of arrogance finally meeting consequence. From the corner of my eye, I could see the neighbors watching, some from their porches, some peeking through blinds. Their murmurs carried faintly across the farm, a mix of astonishment and suppressed amusement. Finally, the invisible injustice that had hung over the property for so long became visible, undeniable, and undeniable in a way she could not spin or deny. Karen slammed her hands against the steering wheel, frustration visible even from a distance. She tried to back up, spinning the tires in a desperate attempt to escape, but the more force she applied, the deeper the mud claimed the vehicle. Her usual confidence evaporated, replaced by panic and disbelief. The shortcut she had taken for granted for months had transformed into a trap that left her powerless, exposed, and utterly human. Her curses rose in pitch, echoing across the fields. She leapt from the SUV, boots sinking into the mud as she tried to push, pull, and heave, but every movement only confirmed the futility of her effort. The mud held her vehicle firmly, as if the land itself were reclaiming its dignity. I stayed back, observing, documenting, and ensuring everything remained safe. The cameras captured every moment, the frantic spins of the tires, the frantic gestures, the sputtering frustration that had once been so carefully concealed by arrogance. I made no move to escalate, no attempt to humiliate beyond what nature and preparation had provided. It was justice served quietly, firmly, without malice, an undeniable lesson in respect. By now, the neighbors had gathered. They whispered in disbelief, some chuckling quietly, others simply watching the spectacle unfold. Karen's authority, assumed for so long, crumbled in the sight of everyone who had silently observed her antics. Each failed attempt to escape deepened the impact. Her pattern of entitlement, previously invisible, was now laid bare for all to see. Minutes passed. The SUV was firmly embedded in the mud. Karen's energy, once relentless, began to drain as she realized the futility of struggle. The absurdity of the situation dawned on her. A shortcut that had cost her dignity, a day she would never live down, and a lesson in humility she could not escape. Finally, she sank to the ground, boots coated in mud, gloves smeared, face red with frustration and shame. She was powerless, and the reality she had ignored for months pressed down on her like the weight of the very soil she had disrespected. Her car remained trapped, her shortcut destroyed, and her assumptions, about entitlement, about her ability to take whatever she wanted, shattered irrevocably. The sun moved slowly, casting long shadows across the farm, and in that light, I realized the story had shifted. What had begun as repeated trespasses and arrogance had transformed into clarity. Justice, calm and inevitable, had a voice. It did not yell. It did not need to. It simply existed in the moment, undeniable and unforgettable. Karen's lesson had been delivered. The trench, the mud, and the watchful eyes of neighbors had done the work that warnings and polite requests could not. Her shortcut, once a symbol of entitlement, had become a monument to accountability. And in that moment, I understood something essential. Power is never in arrogance or disregard. It is in observation, preparation, and the courage to enforce boundaries when others refuse to see them. The mud had dried in patches where her SUV had sunk, leaving a mark on the farm that would serve as a quiet reminder for weeks to come. Karen's frustration had been loud, visible, and undeniable, but the aftermath was quieter, heavier with reflection. The field, once merely a patch of cultivated earth, had transformed into a stage where lessons about respect, entitlement, and accountability played out in full view. Neighbors lingered, some whispering, others nodding in silent acknowledgement. For months, they had witnessed her arrogance, the way she bulldozed over boundaries, the way she assumed she could take what did not belong to her. Yet, they had remained spectators, complicit through silence. Now, confronted with the evidence of her own actions, they had no choice but to reckon with what they had ignored. I walked slowly through the fields, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, observing the tire tracks frozen in time. Each track told a story of arrogance, impatience, and disregard, but also of inevitability. When entitlement meets preparation, when disrespect meets observation, even the most confident assumptions crumble. It was not a story of anger nor revenge, but a demonstration of principles made visible, tangible, and unforgettable. The trench had done its job. It had shifted the narrative, turning a repeated trespass into a lesson in boundaries. Karen's SUV had become more than a vehicle. It was now a symbol of the consequences of assuming privilege without responsibility. She had acted with the confidence of someone untouchable, but in that moment, she had been reminded that every action carries weight, that every disregard has consequences, and that respect for others is not optional, it is essential. As I walked toward the edge of the farm, I noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. Windows that had once glared now peeked cautiously, doors that had slammed shut in disregard now remained closed in contemplation. Whispers traveled along the fences, faint conversations about what had occurred, what had been learned, and what had finally been acknowledged. The lesson had spread further than Karen could have imagined, touching everyone who had once underestimated the quiet strength of boundaries enforced with precision. Even Karen herself had begun to change. Her posture, once defiant, now carried the weight of awareness. Each step she took across the farm required caution, a subtle acknowledgement that the arrogance she had wielded so freely no longer guaranteed control. The moment had stripped away the illusion of invincibility, leaving only the reality of accountability. In the days that followed, the farm returned to its rhythm. The fields healed, crops thrived, and the trench, though filled back in, remained a symbol in memory. Karen avoided the shortcuts, driving carefully along the roads she had once ignored. Neighbors began to engage differently, conversations now threaded with recognition of fairness, respect, and shared space. The dynamic of the neighborhood had shifted, not through confrontation, but through observation, preparation, and undeniable consequence. I reflected on what had unfolded. The lesson had not been easy to orchestrate. It required patience, careful planning, and an understanding of human behavior. But the outcome was undeniable. Patterns of entitlement, when unchecked, will eventually clash with the reality of accountability. The farm, once a battleground of small injustices, had become a canvas where respect was visually reinforced and arrogance was exposed. And in that quiet reflection, a broader truth became clear. Life is full of invisible boundaries, both personal and societal. Often, those who violate them do so without fear because they assume the silence of others. But change begins when observation meets action, when patience meets strategy, and when lessons are delivered in ways that cannot be ignored. True respect is not demanded through threats or anger. It is cultivated through consequence, clarity, and the undeniable visibility of truth. I walked the perimeter once more, feeling the solid earth beneath my boots, the wind brushing against the tall grasses, and the sun beginning its descent. The farm, resilient and enduring, had taught a lesson larger than any single trespass. It had revealed how arrogance is often fragile, entitlement is temporary, and accountability, delivered thoughtfully and deliberately, can transform a moment, a street, and even a community. Karen's shortcut had been taken for granted. The land had claimed its dignity back. And for everyone who witnessed it, a quiet but powerful lesson remained. Boundaries exist not to restrict, but to protect, to preserve, and to demand acknowledgement. The farm was no longer just a sanctuary for crops and soil. It had become a monument to patience, preparation, and quiet justice. And in that realization, the final truth lingered: how many other shortcuts exist in the world? And how many more lessons are waiting for those who refuse to see the boundaries that protect what is rightfully ours? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, I knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning. A beginning where observation, patience, and the courage to act had reshaped not only my farm but the neighborhood itself. The story would echo, quietly, in every corner where entitlement once ruled, reminding everyone that respect is earned, boundaries are real, and accountability is inevitable.